everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today I am going to try to dye yarn with this Dylon hand dye for the first time. I selected black because this is a color that will be really helpful when we're looking at the depth of color penetration. And we are going to use this dye to hand dye 100% wool and 100% cotton yarn. I have never used Dylon before, so we will be following the manufacturer instructions and see what happens and see what we get. 1 packet of Dylon is good for a ½ pound of fiber, and the weight of the dye is 1.75 ounces. I have prepped about 8 ounces of fiber for this experiment. We have 100 grams of 100% wool of the Andes worsted weight yarn from KnitPicks, and 113 grams of Lily Sugar and Cream in white. I pre-soaked all of the yarn in plain tap water overnight. That length of time isn't necessary, I just wanted to be ready to go first thing in the morning. Everything we are using today is dedicated dye equipment. I don't recommend using anything you use for food when you're dyeing yarn with commercial dyes. To start, I have 3 cups of warm tap water. The instructions say 4, but I think 4 would make this sort of a tight fit for me to stir up. So we'll see how well things dissolve. And I'm going to start off by adding 4 tablespoons. 1, 2, 3, a little over 4 tablespoons of salt. And this is non-iodized salt that I am using today. And now we need to stir this up. So the water is, warm. It's definitely warm. It's not hot, I would say. I'll try to get the water maybe a tiny bit hotter from the tap when I dilute this dye in our container. And see, this is where it's good that I double checked my instructions, because apparently we want the salt in our basin, and we will be adding the dye to water without salt. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this. I want to have at least 12 cups of water in here before we get started. We now have 12 cups of salt water in our basin, and maybe about 3½ cups of warm water right here where we will mix up our dye. So I'm tapping down the bag before I cut off the top. And, this actually should all go in pretty easily. There we go. And stir it up. It has sort of a blue tinge to it, so I'm really excited to see what it'll do on yarn. You can see on the spoon it almost has like a navy tinge. Now, if you're new to my channel, I love experimenting with color, I love experimenting with dye, and I'm not always concerned about getting even color. If you're dyeing yarn or fabric and you really want a solid, make sure you have more water so the fibers can move really freely. But I'm not going to be as concerned with stirring the fabric as much as the directions indicate. Okay, I'm not feeling any clumps, so I'm now going to add the dye to our basin. And once again, I'm going to stir this up so it's somewhat even. So we've now got about a little over 15 cups of water, and this is warm, and I'm now going to add our yarn. Okay. Ooh, so immediately when I dunk it, it's reading sort of black on the wool and a little more blue and navy on the cotton. So again, this isn't low immersion what I have set up here, but it is a lower volume. I am dyeing well, it's a little over 200 grams of yarn at a time. In theory, you would probably want it to be a little less crowded if you want a really even tone. But one of the things I'm interested in investigating today is how even of a tone will we get. And after just a short period of time, this cotton is starting to look black. I mean, both of them read black right now. The real question will be how much rinses out in the end. I know from what I've read that I'm expecting to get a lighter color on the wool than the cotton. And from the directions, I should be stirring this a lot more. But I'm confident that there has been dye penetrated to all of the fiber, so we won't have any white patches. But I love a good tonal kettle dyed yarn, so I think at this point I'm going to set and forget and just let this sit for an hour. The directions do say to stir for 15 minutes and then stir regularly for 45 minutes before you start rinsing it in cool water. But instead, I'm going to let this sit for an hour. I might come back and stir every once in a while, but I will then come back and we'll remove the yarn and see how much dye is left in the basin. It has been an hour and there is still a ton of color in this dye bath. But we are going to remove the yarn, trying to let some of the drips drip out. And I am going to place it in another basin so that way we can go and wash all this fiber with cool water as indicated in the instructions. One thing I will note about the amount of color left behind is that this is likely due to the fact that if you want to dye something a solid color, like if you want to dye a shirt solid black, you want there to be more dye than is needed to go into the fiber, because if there's just a little bit of dye, you'll get uneven coverage. So I have a feeling that we could use this to dye a lot more yarn. Right away, before adding any water, I will say that the cotton looks black and the wool looks sort of like a charcoal gray. But let's see how much dye rinses out. Huh, so far so good. Try not to splatter too much. Yeah, so see already the cotton is looking a bit lighter. But let's not forget that the dye bath is also really dark, so there was a lot of color left behind in there as well. Now I'm curious to see how black the cotton will still look when it's dry. So far I'm actually very impressed. Still a lot of dye coming out, but I have a feeling that this is going to take a fair amount of rinsing. And you'll want, using 100% non-superwash wool like this, you will want to take care. You don't want to agitate the yarn too much because you risk felting. But right here, there's still stuff to rinse out. The coverage looks reasonable. It's definitely a paler color, but we might have something reasonably solid, but again, there's still a lot of rinsing left to do. So I will come back once the water starts to clear. The water is starting to clear a bit, so I'm now going to add, I'm just going to use a little bit of Dawn dish soap, and I might need to use soap a couple of times to help. You know, the water is still definitely gray. the residual color rinse out of the yarn. But I'm going to keep rinsing until the water runs clear. But even with the bleeding, we still have a lot of great color in our yarn. So I will come back and show you what the finished yarn looks like. The finished dried yarn has a lot of pigment in it. We have, is it a black? We have something that maybe is just a shade lighter from black, but this cotton is super, super dark. If I hadn't seen the yarn that I dyed after this round, then I would say that this is black. But maybe it's black with a tiny bit of a navy hint. The difference in the penetration of color between the 100% cotton yarn, this was the Lily Sugar and Cream, 113 grams, and the 100% Peruvian Highland wool worsted weight yarn is really striking. There is no doubt that this dye got a lighter shade on the 100% wool than it did on the 100% cotton. This should not come as a huge surprise. I think the packet even maybe says that it'll give a lighter shade on wool and silk and some other protein-based yarns. However, I am curious to see how this dye will work on other types of wool. What about superwash or nylon blends? So there's a lot more to explore, and there's a lot more dye left in this dye pot than I had anticipated. So clearly we have a lot more dyeing to do. The color on this yarn is remarkably solid. I did not stir this nearly as much as the directions indicated, and it's really hard for me to say if this is solid or semi-solid. I will probably call it more of a semi-solid because I doubt it is a 100% true solid. It is hand dyed after all, but this dye seems to absorb extremely slowly, which can allow you to get really even color coverage. Therefore, this means that I might actually recommend this dye if you wanted to over dye some clothing. If it did this well on yarn, I guess imagine if you had some fabric and you were stirring it for a while. I think you might be able to get a pretty even coverage. As for the remaining dye in the vat, it started to skew navy when I added other yarn. These yarns will be featured in some upcoming videos, but I also wanted to share them now so we could talk about how much fiber can you dye with a packet of Dylon hand dye. So I dyed 4 other skeins of yarn. Another one of 100% cotton, and this is a 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon. After that, I dyed 100 grams of 100% superwash merino. And then finally, at the very end, I did one more skein of 100% Peruvian Highland wool. This shows something interesting. It looks like we're getting similar tones with a superwash wool as we do with the cotton, whereas the non-superwash wool gives a lighter color overall. So this is something to consider, that you will get different results with different types of fiber and fiber that has been treated in different ways when you're using these dyes. Clearly, I have more than half a pound of fiber here. I have at least 600 grams of fiber. But there's a hue difference. So I think that if you wanted to get black, that sticking to one packet for half a pound of fiber is probably pretty accurate. But if you don't care as much about the hue, then you can dye a lot more yarn. If you don't want to miss the dyeing videos for these 4 hanks of yarn that I have on top, make sure you subscribe to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel so you can be notified when I release a new video. I really can't get over the fact of how even this coverage looks. I honestly think that this is the most even coverage I have ever gotten on yarn, ever. I think, again, this comes to the fact that we let the yarn sit in the dye bath for an hour, which is longer than I frequently use. And the dye bath was warm, but nowhere close to boiling. It started off at a warm tap water temperature. that, you know, I could comfortably put my hands in. It is honestly difficult for me to tell if there's tonal differences in this yarn right now. It's very subtle, and maybe you'll see some of that when you knit with it, maybe you won't. It really, I think it's going to be really subtle, and any differences, I mean, I think this is as close to a solid yarn as I've ever done. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and right now it is Cellulose Week, where I am focusing on different methods to apply color to cotton-based yarn. And I'm really happy that I decided to try Dylon for the first time. Due to the amount of rinsing, I'll be perfectly honest, it's not my favorite dye. I don't like things that take so long to rinse out. Part of that could be this cotton. I think that this cotton yarn is really a sponge, and it holds on to the other colored liquid for a long time. I had a lot less trouble, ironically, washing the excess dye out of some of the superwash yarns that I played with later. Did you know that there is an Etsy store where you can buy yarn featured in the ChemKnits dyeing videos? The shop is called ChemKnits Creations, and it's filled with dozens of skeins of yarn that are in past dyeing videos and some that haven't even been released yet. So, if you're interested in supporting ChemKnits and getting some of the beautiful yarn at the same time, you should check it out. The link is in the video description. Thank you so much for watching.